But thank you all so much for joining us. Author Fiona Davis is here to discuss her new historical fiction novel, The Stolen Queen, in the latest installment of Author Hour in Massachusetts. So, Fiona Davis is the New York Times bestselling author of several novels, including The Spectacular, Magnolia Palace, and The Lions of Fifth Avenue, which was a Good Morning America book club pick. She's a graduate of the Columbia Journalism School and is based in New York City. So, all nearly 300 of us who are watching live and the many more that will watch the recording, let's give a big virtual round of applause to Fiona for joining us here tonight. And Fiona, how are we doing?
Hi, Robert. Thank you for that wonderful intro. I appreciate it. I cannot believe how many states people are from. This is really, really widespread, and welcome everybody. I'm thrilled. That's incredible.
So, Fiona, congratulations on the success of The Stolen Queen. I know it's been out for a couple of weeks and it's getting a lot of buzz. It's landed on the New York Times bestsellers list once again. You've become synonymous with New York Times bestsellers. So, congratulations on all the success. And can you let the 300 of us know a little bit about the book? What can you tell us about sort of brief overall synopsis of The Stolen Queen?
Sure. So, The Stolen Queen is set at the Met Museum in New York City. And it's set in 1978. And part of it is from the point of view of a curator at the Egyptian art collection called Charlotte. And she's 60 years old. She's been there a long time. She kind of runs the place and gets none of the credit for it. And she is unwillingly teamed up with an overeager 19-year-old assistant to the Met Gala in order to track down a stolen artifact that they are both very personally invested in. And part of it takes place in 1930s in Egypt when the curator Charlotte was a young woman. And it's about mothers and daughters, female friendship. There's lots of hidden secrets. There's a deadly curse, of course. And I like to say it's a mix of mummies and glamour.
I love it. I love it. So, can you tell us a little bit about Charlotte, who is one of your two main female protagonists? And is she based on any sort of real life character?
Yeah, Charlotte is partly inspired by a woman named Christiane de Roche, who was an archaeologist in Egypt in the 1930s, and there was a book called Empress of the Nile by Lynn Olson. It's a nonfiction book. It's really, really great. And I read that, and it just so grounded me in Egypt at that time and what it was like to be a woman archaeologist that I thought, okay, that's my Charlotte. And in the opening of the book, she's 60 years old. And I wanted to have a woman heroine who was that age because I'm 58. And I feel like we're underrepresented in books. It tends to be heroines in their 20s and 30s. And I thought, she's going to have a lot to say. And she certainly did.
And speaking of heroines in their 20s and 30s, can you tell us a little bit about Annie, your other female protagonist?
Yeah, so Annie was fun to write. She's the typical parentified child. Her mother is a former model and is very needy, very emotional, she just relies on Annie for pretty much everything. And so Annie, in the beginning of the book, gets this great opportunity to work at the Met Gala as an assistant. And she is absolutely not qualified. This is the first job really she's ever had, but she's very excited and wants to do her best. And I love the idea of pairing up these two women that are completely different. One is older, very experienced, pretty sure of herself, but does have a terrible secret from her past that she's dealing with every day. And then Annie is kind of, open to whatever, eager to embrace whatever comes her way, and is just she's just not qualified for this job, and she knows it, and that kind of puts her into panic mode. And it's 2 weeks before the Met Gala of 1978. So the pressure's on. The King Tut exhibit is about to open. So there's pressure on everyone in that museum to get things going and to make sure they go smoothly.
And one of the people exerting the most pressure on Annie is her boss, who is iconic. Can you talk a bit about her, both the character in the book and maybe the real life persona? And I guess you use some of her real life quotes. You intersperse them in the book.
I did. So the woman who she was special consultant to the Met Gala in the 70s, was Diana Vreeland. And I knew her name, but I didn't know much about her. And I did a bunch of research and I found that the Met Gala, it makes the money for the Costume Institute, which is one of the departments at the Met. And the Costume Institute has over 80,000 costumes and accessories. And the gala started as a fundraiser, as kind of a 1949 ladies' luncheon in a hotel. And then Diana Vreeland came in the 1970s, and she's like, nope, let's change this. And she turned it into the party of the year, where she invited Mick Jagger and Diana Ross and Jackie Kennedy, and it suddenly became this celebrity-filled event that it is now today. But she's the one who did it, and she was fascinating because she was born in France, and her mom always told her she was ugly. And so as she grew up, she became, of all things, this iconic fashion leader. She was a tornado of a woman. And she came in, she worked for Vogue. She found models like Angelica Houston and Lauren Hutton, who were not your typical cheerleader model. She went for people who were interesting, and she was very striking. And she would, put Vaseline above her eyes to highlight them and have rouge that went all the way to her earlobes. And she spoke in these very enigmatic phrases like, pink is the navy blue of India. She used to say the best thing about London is Paris. And my favorite was unshine shoes are the end of civilization. And she had all of these declarations, which many of them made it into the book. And I wasn't sure about using a real person in the book. Usually I just do fictional characters, but she was such a one of a kind. I knew anything I made up couldn't be even close to as interesting as the actual woman. So I brought her into the book as a character, and I love it. Every scene she was in, she just took off.
So Fiona, you're telling this story. You're using sort of a dual story timelines, if you will, and so you can tell us as little or as much as you'd like. But tell us what's happening in 1936 and 1937 Egypt as the book opens.
Yeah, so the book opens, and she's 19 years old, and she's gotten this wonderful opportunity to be part of a dig in Egypt. And that was when there weren't a lot of women archaeologists or even working, in any form near these excavations. And she gets in there and she really proves herself. And some of the men resent her. And so it's really about this young woman finding herself, becoming very successful, falling in love. All of this stuff is going on while she's there for the year that she's supposed to be there. And then things go horribly wrong. And so I wanted to show the readers what Charlotte was like as a young woman, because as an old woman, she's a little bitter and she's closed off. And I wanted to show a really great contrast between the 60-year-old who's been through life and suffered and this wide-eyed 19-year-old who, will remind the reader of Annie in many ways.
We touched on the two female protagonists, but there's sort of another woman that's core to this story, and that is the female pharaoh. Can you talk a bit about her and the real life inspiration behind her?
Sure. So in the book, Charlotte is obsessed with this rare female pharaoh named Hathorkare. And Hathorkare is based on a real female pharaoh named Hatshepsut. And it sounds like a sneeze and it's hard to say. But Hatshepsut was fascinating. She married her half-brother at 12, as one did in Egyptian royalty. I was talking to Kate Quinn, the author, and she said, yes, the Egyptian family tree is very narrow. And so she marries her half-brother. He dies 7 years later. There's no male heir other than the infant child of a concubine. And so because of that, Hatshepsut stepped up to be regent until the baby was old enough to rule. And she did it very successfully. There was, economic progress. There was peace. There was international trade. There were all of these incredible advances in architecture and art. And then she dies, and the son comes to power, the stepson. And at some point, he orders her statues completely demolished, and many of the images of her on the reliefs hacked away. And because of that, she kind of disappeared from history. We knew there was a female pharaoh, but she didn't seem that important until the Met. There was a team excavating in the 1920s, and they found this quarry filled with these destroyed statues, and they put them together, reassembled them. Many of them are at the Met now. And they said, oh no, she must have been very important, but what happened? And they came to the conclusion that the stepson must have been angry that she stayed in power so long. And so he did this to get back at her after she died. And in fact, the catalog of the Met in the 1950s described Hatshepsut as a vain, ambitious, and unscrupulous woman and a detested stepmother. But then in the 60s, a scholar realizes, oh no, all of this desecration happened at least 24 years after her death, which is a really long time to hold a grudge. It didn't make sense. And then they kind of figured out, okay, maybe it was that the stepson was near the end of his reign. He wanted his son to take over, but there may have been females from other clans who were threatening that succession. And it makes sense because once the succession was assured, the destruction stopped. And I read all this about Hatshepsut, and I thought, okay, here's a woman who was revered and then erased and then reviled and then finally restored. Right? And they recently found her mummy, which is a very exciting thing that I recreate in the book. And I just thought, what an interesting timeline for this woman and how women have been forgotten in history. And so Charlotte in the book is very obsessed with her. And I changed the name. People have asked me this because I didn't want to take away from the scholars and researchers who had done the actual research on Hatshepsut. And I needed Charlotte to do it. And so I changed it, but explain it very clearly in the author's note, why I was obsessed with her and why I recreated her in the story.
Another thing that you stress in the author's note, and folks, read the author's note at the end. It's very important. Is the artwork associated with the stolen queen. Can you talk a bit more about that artifact, both in the book and in real life, what that's based on?
Yeah. So there's a beautiful artifact in the Met called a fragment of a queen's face. And it's only this part of a statue that has long since been demolished. All that's left are the chin and part of the lips. It's the most beautiful lips and chin I have ever seen. It's a huge, popular draw at the museum because it's exquisite. You can only imagine what the rest of it must have been like. They're not sure who it was. They think it may have been Nefertiti, but it's a beautiful piece. And I wanted that to go stolen in my book. But that actual piece has not gone stolen. So I didn't want to confuse people. So in the book, in real life, it's made of a stone called yellow jasper. So it's yellow gold. And I changed it into a blue stone, and it's called the Cerulean Queen in the book. But whenever I'm talking about that in the book, if you Google the Met and fragment of a queen's face, you can see what I'm actually thinking of in my head.
And so art theft is one of the themes of the book, as is repatriation. Wonder if you could talk a little bit about that and maybe your personal feelings about that.
Yeah, it's very interesting, the whole question. And actually, I'll lead into it by telling you how I came to the idea of writing this book, because it does have to do with it, where I read in the New York Times, there was an article about the 2018 Met Gala. And Kim Kardashian went, and I never thought I'd be mentioning Kim Kardashian in my book talks, and I am. But she wore this beautiful gold tights, sparkly gown. And at one point, she stood next to this gold sparkly sarcophagus that the Met had acquired the year before for $4 million. The photo went viral to the point that the Jordanian smuggler who'd stolen the sarcophagus saw it. And he said to an undercover informant that he'd never gotten paid. And that got back to the New York DA's office that has a whole unit on stolen art. And they did some digging and they found that the export license had been forged. And in fact, the Met in the end had to send it back to Egypt. And so that's where the idea for the book came, because I thought, what a fun mix of pop culture and ancient Egypt and ancient art, all embodied in one museum. That's my way in. And so, but the idea of giving back things that were improperly taken has been a discussion for a long time, and it's only just been ramping up among museums all around the world, not just the Met. They're all dealing with it. And you have things like the Benin bronzes, which are these beautiful bronzes that were taken from what's now modern Nigeria by the British during a violent and bloody occupation in 1897. There are photographs of the British just standing next to piles of loot that they just took. They just took anything they wanted. And so they want them back. But there's a question, and this is a question for all of the things that have been, transferred across the world and away from their point of origin. And it's, what if the country that wants them back, what if they don't have a safe place to store them, either because of humidity or security purposes? What if the country needs money and so they sell them to a Russian oligarch or someone who then puts them in their private villa, and then no one can see them, right? Not the researchers, not the scholars, not school kids. And so it's this tricky question of where do they belong? Do they belong to humanity? Do they belong to a particular country? And it's a question that all museums are struggling with. And I don't answer it in the book. There's no way I could. But the characters grapple with it through the course of the story, for sure.
So you answered, what inspired you to write the book, why you wrote the book. Can you talk about a little bit about the research that went into this book? What were some of the things you did to make sure everything you wrote that you meant to be historical accurate was historically accurate?
Yeah, I was kind of nervous because this was a little bit out of my wheelhouse with Egyptology and that kind of thing. But I did what I did as a journalist. I just dive into the research and I reach out to anyone who's an expert and I interview them and ask dumb questions and try and figure out what I don't know. And so with this book, I interviewed everybody at the Met I could. I interviewed Met staffers for the Met Gala, curators, docents, security guards, handlers, technicians. It was so much fun because that place is like a city and there's all these different people who run it. There's lampers who their only job is to change light bulbs. It's quite something. So I learned a lot. I learned, I went down to the staff caf, which is where they eat, which is in the basement, and down these long hallways in the basement where there's storage on either side. And there's signs every so often that say yield to art in transit. And so if art's coming by, stand back, flatten yourself against the wall. And I also, it was incredible. I walked around the Egyptian wing with an Egyptologist, and she talked about the different, pieces that she would look at a sarcophagus and read the hieroglyphs right off it. She was fluent in hieroglyph, which was so cool. And I also had a wonderful tour by a security guard, and he pointed out there's these smudges on certain walls in the galleries where years of security guards leaning against them and their polyester suits have rubbed off. And it's just that kind of detail that makes you feel like you're actually in the museum with me as I'm writing. And that security guard actually went on and has written a beautiful memoir called All the Beauty in the World. His name is Patrick Bringley. It's a beautiful piece about being a security guard at the Met, about love and loss and art. And I highly recommend it. It's a terrific companion piece to this book. So that's what I did in terms of, learning what I could. But then I also went to Egypt because I thought I have to. This is the first book out of 8 that I've gone outside of New York, right? People have always asked me, when are you going out? When are you going out? And I thought, okay, I'm gonna go big here or go home. So I went to Egypt and it was wonderful. We were picked up in 4:30 in the morning when our plane landed, and we were in a van and we went through Cairo with all its busy streets, and we turned a corner and there were the pyramids. Right? It was so shocking. Just they were pink as the sun was rising. It was so beautiful. And then we went up the Nile and saw the Temple of Karnak. We went to King Tut's tomb in the Valley of the Kings. And just to get a sense of what it's like with the sand and what happens when the sand blows and the sun kind of gets covered up and everything turns orange. It's such a beautiful country to actually get all the senses working of what's it sound like, what's it taste like, what do I see? And that way really bring the reader with me in the book. So it's almost like they're taking a trip to Egypt as well. One of the most incredible things I saw there was in the Cairo Museum, they have the mummy of Hatshepsut. And so I'd done all this, research on her and was very interested in her. And then you go into this room and it's kind of dark and you're supposed to keep your voice down. And I walked around the mummy and it occurred to me, oh my goodness, that's her. That's the woman who walked the earth 3,500 years ago and ruled Egypt. Those are her fingernails, that's her hair. And it was so shocking. It was like past and present and future just all colliding. And I wanted to try and bring that into the book as well. That sense of awe of how the ancient past really isn't that ancient. We're still the same people.
Joyce in the chat would like to know, and I'm going to mainly hold audience questions till the end, but it's relevant. How long did it take you to write this book? So including the research you just spoke about, how long did it take you to finish The Stolen Queen?
Yeah, it's about a year and a half. And I'll tell you what I do. It's pretty fast. I don't have kids, so I think maybe that speeds up the process some. So what I do is I do about 3 or 4 months of intense research, and that's where I'm interviewing everybody, I'm reading everything I can, I'm watching documentaries, and basically stuffing my head with the characters and the places of that time period. that I want to focus on. And I keep all these notes, and eventually characters start coming to me of, oh, well, what if there was a curator in her 60s? Or, what if there's this younger woman working for the Met Gala? And what if they had to meet in order to solve a mystery? I like to describe this book, by the way, I forgot to mention this, as Indiana Jones meets Thelma and Louise meets
Oh,
The Devil Wears Prada.
oh,
That's
okay.
what this
Yep.
book is. And so once I've gotten a sense of that and I start getting ideas for scenes and I know what these characters want, I know what obstacles I need to put in their way because the last thing you want to read is about a happy family or something that gets happier, right? That's a boring book. So you have these characters, they want something desperately. What can go in their way? What are some twists where I can make the reader think one thing and then, pull a switch and have them completely blow their minds. I love that kind of thing when I'm reading, so I like to put it in. And once I've done that, I get a sense of usually the first line. And that's when I know it's time to start writing. And I write a pretty quick first draft. Well, what I do first is I kind of plot it out each timeline. And I have to do it kind of carefully because there's always a mystery, and I don't want to screw up one timeline with revealing something too early on the other. That's always tricky. Those weeks that I'm trying to meld the timelines, I'm usually drinking a lot of wine at night because it helps get me through the pain. It's like a jigsaw puzzle. But once I've got that, I have a roadmap and I can write the book. I usually write the older timeline first, then the newer one, and then weave them together. And then I do about 10 revisions where I'm layering more in, making the characters deeper, um, that kind of thing. And then after that, it goes to my agent and my editor, and then it's out the door.
That's interesting that you write the timelines separately. I was wondering if you jumped back and forth or not. So that's interesting. Um, really, really enjoyed the way you wrote the book with the two different narrators and the dual timelines, as I said. Um, Curious, all the research that you did. What was the one thing that maybe surprised you the most?
Oh, there's a couple of things. In terms of the Met building, I learned that they have 1.5 million objects in their collection, but only 6% are on view at any one time. And so there's all these treasures buried in the basement and, around the museum that may never see the light of day, which is kind of amazing. And the other thing that really blew my mind was how the Met Gala has changed. The perfect example of it is in 1949, a ticket to the Met Gala cost $50. Today, a ticket costs $75,000. It raises $26 million every year for the museum. I know, which is why my publisher didn't send me. I'm very upset.
Well, actually, Fiona, I did want to ask you, what has the reception been from past and present employees of the Met? Maybe folks you consulted while researching the book. Have they read your book, and what did they think? And maybe you'll be able to score some free tickets to the Met.
There we go. I love it. Yeah, they've been wonderful. They were really great to work with, just in terms of being able to access people and again ask very dumb questions and learn so much about the museum. And it's wonderful. They're carrying the book in their museum gift shop, which is really, really exciting. I went and signed a whole bunch of copies, so you can get a signed copy from them if you want one. And yeah, it's been great. They've been really helpful and real partners in putting this together.
Coworker of mine also read your book, and we were talking about, as one does, when this book is made into a movie, Fiona, who's playing Charlotte? Any idea?
Yeah, it's so funny you asked that because when I start coming up with the idea for the characters, one of the first things I do is find a movie star who and I put it up on my bulletin board over there. So I have something visual and a three-dimensional person to relate to. I find that's very helpful. For example, in my book, The Magnolia Palace, which is about the Frick family and Henry Frick, who was this awful man. And I knew as I wrote, I needed to make him a three-dimensional character, and he was really vilified and hated. And so when I imagined him, I imagined Anthony Hopkins, right? Because everyone loves Anthony. So it softened him a little. So for Charlotte, I imagined Charlotte Rampling, the French actress. I think she'd be perfect for it. And then I named her after her even. And then for Annie, there's an actress called Merritt Weaver, who's a wonderful younger actress. And she's just so talented and she's interesting. She's again not your pretty starlet, your typical pretty little, LA starlet. She's interesting. She's got depth to her. And I think she'd be a great Annie.
So Anissa asks, what was the hardest scene in the book to write and why?
Oh, that's a good question, Anissa. The hardest scene. I That is such a good question. She stumped me. I would say starting out the early scenes in the Egypt 1930s time period, because there was so much I had to, what kind of bed did they sleep on? Where did they stay? What did they eat? What was it like? And what tools did they use? What was the hierarchy of a dig? I had so many questions, so I had to keep on going back and reading, finding my books and learning really interesting things like they would sleep on cots under a tent in the desert, and they would put cups of water under the legs of each cot so that the scorpions couldn't climb up. Yeah, and it's that kind of detail that I'm like, yeah, because I know if I can lay that in, it will really ground the reader in where I am. So I would say those early scenes were tricky because I had so much technically to get right. And then I had to, of course, create a scene that was dynamic with characters you know, who were struggling with something as well. And so I want the reader to keep on reading, to just feel that they can't stop turning the page. And that's important that I don't, as a historian, lay too much history in where I'm teaching too much. And in fact, after I'd written those early chapters, I went through and pulled a lot out because it was a lot of me going, well, I know all about this. And that's not what the reader needs to hear.
Anytime I'm reading a book and there's scorpions or a snake bite Fiona, I often just will jump a page or two ahead. Okay, so
Fair enough.
all right, yeah. And a similar question from Anissa, and I apologize if I'm mispronouncing Anissa's name. I think it's Anissa. Who was the hardest character to write and why?
Oh, the hardest character. I'd say the easiest was Diana Vreeland because so much of what she says is what she really said. And, putting her in the book was just a gift. It was like she came down and would tell me what to do. The hardest scene, there was one scene, and I don't want to give too much away, but there's
Yeah.
a scene near the end of the Egypt story with Charlotte that was very tough to write. And once you read it, you'll know why. But yeah, I'd say that was a tough one because there's just a lot going on. It's an action-filled scene, and there's a lot of loss.
So folks, feel free to start getting your audience questions in now. I'm going to intersperse my questions with the audience questions because a lot of these questions just make sense to ask now. Marlo wants to know, how long were you in Egypt for your research and who provided you with the most valuable resources? And Marla loved the book, 5 exclamation points.
Oh, thank you, Marla. Yeah. We were in Egypt for about 10 days or 2 weeks, I think around 10 to 2 weeks. And it was April. It was pretty hot by then. If you go in January, February, it's not so hot, but it was pretty hot. And I would say the most valuable resource was our tour guide. He had been doing this his whole life. This is what he does. He does these incredible tours. He took us everywhere and knew everybody. He was quite a character. And I'd feel bad for him because he'd take us on a tour of a temple, tell us all about it. We'd spend 2 hours and then we'd get on the bus and I would corner him and ask him more questions because I just needed to know more. So he was very patient with me. And I would say he was the most valuable person I could have talked to.
So I am going to sort of reword Ashley's question. Basically, did you ever consider any other settings, additional settings for this book? A third location, perhaps, besides the Met and Egypt?
No, I didn't. I knew I would have my hands full, and I knew that the first half of the book would go back and forth between 1930s and 1978. And then the middle of the book is the Met Gala, which is kind of a big jumping off point. And then there's a lot going on in one timeline, but two different character points of view. So Charlotte and Annie. So it was a pretty complicated book to structure. and to make it feel smooth. So I think adding another location might have been tricky, although I'm curious which one she's thinking of. If she has one in mind, I'd be curious to know what that is.
So speaking of the structure, Lori wants to know, how did you choose 1978 for the later timeline? Was that due to like age considerations, or was it the King Tut exhibit, or what were your thoughts there?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So I knew I wanted 1930s because Lynn Olson's book was so specific to that, that I wanted to stay true to that. So if in order to do that and then have a character in her 60s, it would be in the 70s, sometime in the 70s. And so that made sense. And then 78 specifically made sense because the Temple of Dender had just opened, and that's the temple where they hold the Met Gala in that this beautiful gallery with this wall that's just completely open to Central Park. And the Temple of Dender was interesting because it was a temple that was along the banks of the Nile. And in the 60s, the government was building the Aswan Dam. And once that was finished, it would flood all the Nile Valley, and all of these temples would be lost. And so all these countries got together and they said, okay, let's save them. And New York got the Temple of Dender and they took it apart piece by piece, transported it to New York. They put it under one of those tennis bubbles in the park. And then they eventually reassembled it. And it opened in September of 1978. And then the King Tut exhibit was about to open in December of 78. We know the pressure of that. It was the first blockbuster. And right in the middle of that, in November, was the Met Gala. So it meant that I had a perfect storm of pressure on everybody in the Met in order to, fulfill their jobs and do what they were supposed to do. So yeah, it felt like a perfect storm of a time period.
So one supporting character we didn't touch on. We talked about Annie's sort of boss, if you will, but we didn't talk about Charlotte's boss. Wilmer wants to know, how would you describe Frederick? And then she also notes that, or he also notes that, or they, I should say, I'm not quite sure. I have read all your novels and I just can't put them down once I start reading. So they're a big fan of yours, Fiona. But can you tell us a little bit about Frederick?
Yeah, thank you. It's a great question. So Frederick is the curator, the head top dog at the Egyptian art collection. And in the book, he's not based on anyone. He's completely fictional. And he's one of those bosses that I think we've all had who doesn't do any of the work but takes all the credit. And so Charlotte's the one who has to, predict what he's going to do and kind of make things right and smooth things over with the employees who are working under him and who are asked to do very difficult, almost impossible tasks. And so her job is really hard, but Frederick kind of comes in and he likes to cause chaos wherever he goes. And he also he's an expert on Hathorkare / Hatshepsut. And because of that, the study and the research that Charlotte is doing on this female pharaoh is very threatening to him. And so she's just got a lot on her plate to deal with in terms of furthering her career and just, dealing with the day to day. And Frederick is the cause of that.
Well, wasn't the biggest fan of Frederick, but I think that was the point. So Diana asks, what about Egyptian culture did you love the most?
Oh, you know what I found fascinating is the way women had rights in ancient Egypt that they did not in the 1970s, right? In the 1970s, you could not, if you were a woman, you couldn't get a loan or a mortgage or a credit card without a man co-signing for you. And in ancient Egypt, women could easily get divorced. They could keep their property. They could keep their children. They could have kids out of wedlock. That was no problem. You could have sex out of wedlock. It was a very open, egalitarian, fair society in many ways. And that surprised me. I was quite shocked at that. They also had these crazy festivals every so often that sound a lot like Burning Man. And, they knew how to have a good time, those Egyptians.
Another supporting character folks are asking about, Holly wants to know, who or what was your inspiration for the character of Mark? Was he based on a real person or a fictional creation? And of course, Mark is Charlotte's love interest.
Yeah, so Mark and Charlotte have been together a long time. He's a playwright, and they've kind of fallen into a rhythm, but it's not that fierce first love because she was burned in first love, early on, and she's just not willing to give of herself. And so that they have a bit of a rocky time of it. He's not based on anyone. Um, he's kind of, that boyfriend who everybody had who was like, yeah, he's a great guy, that kind of thing. And he is a great guy. But they're just not quite clicking as the story is starting. Also because his daughter comes to live with them unexpectedly, so she's thrown for a loop about that too.
See, Marianne, we'll circle back to your question towards the end. Sally wants to know, was there a piece of information from your own research that you really wanted to include, but you couldn't make it fit within the story?
Oh, I'm sure there was. I would say there was a lot, again, in in the early 1930s Egyptian sections where I would put in a lot about, just too much about the day-to-day life of an early Egyptian or over-explaining things so that it almost became way too complicated. And I remember I put the first draft away for a bit and didn't think about it, and I came back to it. And then I took so much out because, again, you want the story to move along and you don't want to feel like you're teaching the reader something. It should just come in as if they're there and, they assimilate the information you're giving them very, very smoothly. And it was clunky. And so there was all these really interesting facts that I found out about ancient Egypt or being an archaeologist that I simply had to remove.
And then Jill asks a similar question, wondering, so you had mentioned that you, I think, revised the book roughly 10 times. Were there any characters or any storylines that were initially in the book that didn't make the final version that you care to tell us about?
Yeah, there was a big change at the end, but I can't tell you because it would be a spoiler. It was a change that my editor suggested, and she was absolutely right. And so yeah, there was one, but I'm afraid unless, once everybody's read it, we can discuss it further. But I can't reveal it now.
No worries. So, folks, I'm going to keep the next few questions to the Stolen Queen. But if folks have more general questions about Fiona's writing process, and I don't want to dwell on previous books, but if there's a question or two about a previous book she's written, we can get to that perhaps at the end if we have time. So Lisa says, and I already know the answer to this, Fiona, and you can go there if you want, but Lisa asks, the Museum of Natural History makes a guest appearance in The Fabulous Stolen Queen. Are there any other New York landmarks you'd love to write about?
Oh yeah, there's so many, and it's so funny. In each book, I usually do an Easter egg of one of the other buildings, just to, keep anyone who's read all the books will go, oh yeah, she's mentioning the Dakota there or something like that. There are so many buildings in New York. I feel like I could keep on going forever. I joke around that by the 18th book, I'll be doing the gas station on the corner of 11th Avenue, but I'll make it work. We'll make it work. But yeah, there's so much. I've looked at Carnegie Hall. The Flatiron Building comes up a lot from readers. The Chrysler Building comes up. I think Central Park itself would be a really good setting, just as a location. And then yeah, I would say all of those would be fascinating. And what's funny is so many of my books, the ideas come from readers where the New York Public Library, which is the lines of Fifth Avenue, the readers had talked about the library all the time. And I finally started doing research. And what I'm doing when I'm research, whether it's this book or any of them, is I'm looking for the surprises. And so for that book, I learned that when they built the New York Public Library, they included a 7-room apartment deep inside for the superintendent and his wife and his kids to live in because he had to keep, it running, the furnace, everything like that in 1911. And they lived there for 30 years. His daughter was born in the library. And the kids used to play baseball using books as bases in the rooms until they got caught. And I just thought, oh, a family living in the library, right? That's a perfect book. And then after I finished the one before this one, I was wondering where to set a book. And I got an email through my author website. And it was a woman who said, I'm 85 years old. I'm a former Rockette. And if you want to know all the secrets of Radio City Music Hall, you should call me. And I thought, oh, done, right? That's a book. And she was wonderful. She connected me with other Rockettes who had danced there in the 40s, 50s. She had all of these archival materials. And in fact, on the launch party for that book, she came to it. It was in this big, beautiful theater in Spring Lake, New Jersey. And she came and she sat in the front row and she answered questions. And at the end, I was signing books in the lobby. And I looked over and they'd set up a table for her and she was signing books too, which I just thought was great. It's just a wonderful, I think, connection between readers and me that I'm really grateful for because it's been so much fun.
So Fiona, we had talked a bit about your writing process. You described yourself, I think, more as a plotter as opposed to a pantser. And you talked about how it took you roughly a year and a half to write the book. Can you talk a little bit more about any maybe rituals or daily routines you have when you're writing the book?
Yeah, sure. I was a journalist first. So I went to Columbia Journalism School and I got a master's there. And then I freelanced and worked for a theater magazine and that kind of thing. And, I think because of that, I don't really get writer's block because as a journalist, if you don't write the book or you don't write the article, you don't get paid. And so that kind of, makes you you sit in your seat and you write. I try to write, if I'm doing the first draft, around 1,500 words a day. And that gets me a first draft by around 3 to 4 months. And basically what I'm doing is trying to trick myself to sit down and do it because I will do anything to avoid it. It feels like homework. That first draft, whether you're dealing with a blank page, I find really tough. I love editing. I can do that, no problem. But writing the first sentence and, making the next sentence and then the next one, it's just like pulling teeth. And so for that, I'll reward myself with like a cup of tea or go get chocolate or something. Clearly there's a lot of chocolate going on. And, just to get myself through it because I honestly, I'll go do laundry, I'll do anything but write that first draft. But once it's done, it's such a relief. And then the rest of the day is free to go play.
So Diane has a question, somewhat similar to the previous question. Do you always have a certain number of pages you have to have for each book? And does this drive you? Does this drive when you know it's time for your story to come to an end? So you just talked about how many words you write per day. Do you know how many pages the publisher tell you in advance? Your editor tells you this book needs to be 350 pages or less. How does that work?
Yeah, they go by word count, and your contract usually says how many words it should be. It's usually a range. I try to hit around 90, 95,000 words. That's usually just that's the right amount for me to write a story that doesn't feel overblown or too skeletal. But I know other authors, that overwrite by 140,000 words and then they take out 40,000. And I just couldn't imagine doing that. My way is I usually do the first draft, it's around high 80s, and then I just start layering in and it gets longer and longer and longer. But yeah, so that's kind of the way into it. My parents are engineers, so I figure it out very carefully. Okay, if I need to get it done by June, I need to do this many words a day, 4 or 5 days a week. And then I'll write a chapter and then edit it the next day just to give myself a break. And you just plow through. I plow through that as fast as I can.
So I'm going to combine two questions. So let's see here. Mary Jo wants to know, who are your favorite authors? And then an anonymous attendee asks, do you have any author friends who you bounce ideas off of or give and get feedback? And would they be anyone we know? And she also notes, can't wait to read The Stolen Queen. I loved The Spectacular. So
Oh,
any favorite authors, Fiona? And do you have any author friends that you give feedback to?
yeah, sure. So favorite authors include Marie Benedict, of course, Kate Quinn, Linda Cohen Loigman. Um, oh, there's so many. Edith Wharton, Sarah Waters is a favorite. Geraldine Brooks. There's just, yeah. I mean, I love historical fiction, and when it's done well, I think it's such a joy to read, and you learn so much. And then in terms of fellow authors, what's wonderful is I live in the New York area, and there's a whole bunch of us who had other careers before we became writers. And so we usually became writers in our 40s or 50s. And because of that, it's a really supportive group that doesn't feel like, oh, if, someone hits the list, then someone won't. A rising tide lifts all boats. And so we all support each other as much as we can. And that's been wonderful because suddenly you have a whole new set of friends who you never expected. And some of them are my favorite authors. And we definitely turn to each other when it's about business stuff, hey, how did you handle this? Or what about this? We do Zooms every so often where we get together and kind of throw things out and, ask questions. And it's really wonderful and supportive. And for The Stolen Queen, in fact, I'd written the first draft and I knew the first half of the book wasn't quite working. It wasn't lifting off the way it should. And I was talking to Linda Cohen-Leugman, who wrote a beautiful book. Her latest is called The Love Elixir of Augusta Stern. Beautiful, beautiful book, and gotten tons of attention, as it should. And she said, "Oh, send it to me." And so I sent her the manuscript and she read it in a day and came back to me and said, "Here, just rework all these chapters, put them in a different order. Here's the order I would put them in." And she was totally right. And suddenly the book, took on a whole new life and had a lot of energy and propulsion, which is what it needed. And she could see that. When you're doing it yourself, and I think this is true for anything, for painting or poetry, you need a good editor. You need someone to help you see the big picture because you just can't see the forest for the trees when you're in it so specifically.
So I'm sure you get this question all the time. If you don't want to answer it, that's fine. But we have several variations of the same question. Essentially, Catherine asks, of all your books, which one ranks as your number one favorite?
It's a tough question. All of them when I'm working on them are my favorite. It's usually when I'm in, right after the hard work's done and it feels like it's shaping up into something. That's when I'm absolutely in love with that book. It's hard to pick one. They're all so different. And you can read them in any order. They're all about New York locations, but different time periods, different characters, different settings. And so, yeah, it's hard to pick. What's interesting about writing a book is you finish it, you get it off to your editor, then it gets copy edited and proofread. And by the time you've done all that, you're so sick of looking at it. And then it goes off to the sales team and the marketing team. And in the meantime, you start working on another book. Because I find if I'm not, working on a book, I tend to buy living room furniture because I need something to do. And that's always dangerous. So I'll start working on the next book. And then it's time for this book to come out, which it came out January 7th. And so then suddenly you're talking about the book again, and it's like visiting old friends because you haven't thought about them in a while. And it's like, oh, right, yes, Charlotte, Annie. And I love that. I love kind of bringing them back and remembering them and sharing them with other people and getting people's reactions after so much hard work working on it.
So this is a very specific question from Dee. With all your books, do you have a scene or character where an event or memory forces an appearance on you from your past that is or was difficult for you to deal with in real life?
Wow, what a question. Yeah, I'll be honest. I was going through a divorce when or I'd gone through a divorce and come out the other end. And at that point, I'd been doing journalism for a long time and I had this idea for a book and I thought, oh, let me see if I can write it. I won't tell anyone. I'll just see if I can write a book. And that became my first book. And in it, there is a heartbroken journalist who's kind of putting her life back together. And I would say that one is probably the closest to me. They often say your first book is the one that is, more biographical. And then you start, creating characters that are just completely different from you, which is really fun. So I'd say The Dollhouse is one of the ones that's most close to, what I was going through and what I was trying to figure out.
So, Fiona, you can give as much or as little as you'd like. And I know The Stolen Queen has only been out for 3 weeks, but we got about a dozen of your readers asking what's next, where will it take place, and questions along those lines. Also, someone asking, thank you so much for your fascinating books set in one of my favorite cities. Do you ever think you'll write about the World Trade Center?
Ooh, no, I don't think I could do that. It's too close. I was here then and lost people. So that would not be that wouldn't be helpful. And you know, that's a book that other people have written and done really well. It's almost like, you know, even with COVID, when we all went through that, there's certain things that are traumatic that it's hard to write, but some people can do it really well. And I'm just not there yet for that. But I think it would be an incredible book. I love how buildings have changed over time, you know, like taking the Dakota in 1880 versus 1980. And so I like those long lengths of time to compare. And the World Trade Center wasn't around quite long enough. But the next book I'm very excited about, it's set at a place that no one has heard of. And to the point where even if I'm in New York and I mention it, the people respond with a blank look. And I'm sure some people here might, though. It's called the Morris Jumel Mansion. It's the oldest house in New York City. It's located on 160th Street. It looks like it belongs in the South. It's got these white pillars and these columns in front. It's a huge mansion surrounded by gardens. It's stunning. And it was the headquarters for George Washington for a few months during Revolutionary War. In the 1800s, it was the home of a woman named Eliza Jumel. And she was so interesting. She was born the daughter of a prostitute in Rhode Island. She came to New York and she became the richest woman in New York because she was really good at selling and buying real estate. And she became this, you know, she had so much money. She bought this beautiful house. And her second husband was Aaron Burr, who we know from Hamilton. But it didn't last long because he was trying to take her money. She didn't like that. She was kind of crazy. I love her. And so to get back at him, she hired as her divorce attorney Alexander Hamilton Jr. And so there's just so much going on. It's a wonderful place. It's not known at all. You know, the Met doesn't need me to write about it. People know the Met. They're fine. But the Morris Jumel Mansion is struggling. They could use a spotlight. And I'd love to just get more people there and get people to know Eliza Jumel and just find something, you know, a secret in New York, a hidden gem that should get more attention.
So Mary Ann would like to know, are there any bookstores where Fiona has signed books you can order from? And I know you mentioned the Met, the gift shop at the Met has them. Is that something you can order online, Fiona? I don't want to get too far in the weeds. Or is that something you have to purchase in person?
I'm not sure if they're online. You can check, but I know the New York Public Library is doing a limited personalized signed offering. So the New York Public Library, you can do that online and get a signed and personalized book if you do it quickly. I'm not sure how long that's going to be lasting. And yeah, and there's also bookshops like Shakespeare and Company here in New York that has signed copies. I've done a lot of tours, so a lot of those places have signed copies. But also, this is so much about supporting your local independent bookstore. And what was the name of the bookstore that's fun?
Fiona, very good point. Yes, Wellesley Books.
Wellesley Books. And so I think it's so important to support your local, even if they might not be signed, you know, just because they're such an important part of our community, as our libraries, of course.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning that, Fiona. And there will be a link in the follow-up email, folks, to purchase a copy directly from Wellesley Books online. So lots of positive, wonderful comments in the chat. I'm not going to go through all of them. Just know, Fiona, you are loved by everyone who's watching. Karen says, thank you so much, Fiona. You are always so informative and interesting to listen to. I have read all of your books and thoroughly loved them all, and I can't wait to read The Stolen Queen.
Oh, that is so kind. Please thank you everybody for listening in. And you know, I think the focus of this book is to approach a building like the Met or an institution like the Met, not as a collection of objects, but a collection of stories. And so when you go to visit a museum, you're looking at the stories behind the objects. And I think that really enriches our sense of the time and places of the past.
So Fiona, is there anything, and I'm usually the behind the scenes tech guy, so is there anything I should have asked you that I didn't ask you that you'd like to address now? Or is there anything that you would like to say before we start to wrap things up?
Yeah, I thought you covered everything beautifully. Thank you. You nailed it. It was great. The one thing I will mention, and only because we were talking about it earlier, was that if you get the audiobook, at the very end, you'll hear a song. And it's a song written by a good friend of mine called Jenny Bruce. And we were chatting last January, And she read all the books, and I said, I'll send you the manuscript of the new book. And she read it and said, I want to write a song inspired by it. And so it's called The Forgotten Queen. It's a beautiful song. You can find it on Spotify or any of your music platforms. But if you get the audiobook, it's at the very end of the book, and then after that comes the author's note. So give it a listen. It's such a beautiful tune, and it's just a perfect pairing with this book.
Fiona, where can folks learn more about you? Where can they follow you for future projects?
Sure. My website is fionadavisbooks.com. I do a newsletter every month, which has kind of fun facts about the inspiration and research behind the books. And there's also all my tours are listed there. And I'm hoping to get to the Boston area in the fall, so stay tuned. And then I'm on Instagram and Facebook as Fiona Davis Author.
All right. So with that, folks, let's give Fiona a big virtual round of applause for a great conversation. Please, for those watching live, fill out the feedback survey when you exit the Zoom, and look for a follow-up email from me in the next hour that will have a link to this recording. This will be up on YouTube in the next 30 minutes. We'll also have a list of upcoming author visits. We have a lot of great historical fiction authors over the next 9 weeks or so. And there'll also be information from Wellesley Books on how you can purchase a copy of The Stolen Queen. So thank you all so much, and I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their night. Thanks again, Fiona.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you. What a wonderful opportunity. I'm thrilled to have done this.
Yeah, they're great. Have a good one.
Bye.